For thousands of years, humans lived without kings. No crowns, no royal palaces, no inherited thrones. No one sitting above everyone else demanding taxes because his grandfather happened to be important. And yet, eventually, humans created kings. Not just powerful leaders, but rulers whose authority could pass from parent to child, whose commands could reach thousands of strangers, whose wealth could be protected by soldiers, and whose right to rule could be presented as something ordained by the gods. So how did we get there? How did human beings go from small communities where an arrogant leader could simply be ignored, to civilizations where an entire society could be organized around one royal family? The surprising answer is that nobody really invented the king. Kingship emerged slowly when several different kinds of power began connecting with one another. And the first thing humans had to invent wasn't the crown. It was a reason to stay. For most of human history, people lived in relatively small communities. If somebody became too aggressive, too selfish, or too obsessed with telling everyone else what to do, there were ways of dealing with them. People could mock them. They could refuse to cooperate. They could stop listening. And, perhaps most importantly, they could leave. That last option was incredibly powerful. If your community became unbearable, you could pack up and move somewhere else. A leader couldn't easily tax people who had disappeared into the landscape. He couldn't control farmland that didn't exist yet, and he couldn't build a permanent dynasty when everyone around him could simply walk away. That doesn't mean early human societies were perfectly equal or peaceful. They weren't. Some people had more influence than others. Age, family connections, hunting ability, ritual knowledge, generosity, personality, and access to resources could all create differences in status. A respected hunter might have influence. A skilled warrior might be listened to. A ritual specialist might command enormous respect. But influence isn't the same thing as kingship. The crucial difference is permanence. A powerful person can be influential today. A king needs a system that makes him powerful tomorrow and allows that power to continue after he dies. That required a major transformation in human life. People began settling down. Instead of constantly moving through the landscape, communities increasingly returned to the same places. They cultivated plants, raised animals, built houses, stored food, and invested in land. And this changed politics completely. Because once your wealth is attached to a place, leaving becomes expensive. Your grain is here. Your animals are here. Your house is here. Your fields are here. Your ancestors may even be buried here. Suddenly, ambition had an address, and wealth could accumulate. A successful family could produce more food than it immediately needed. That surplus could be stored. Stored wealth could be protected. Protected wealth could be inherited. And inherited wealth could create inequality. Imagine one family has an unusually successful harvest. Their granary is full. Another family has suffered a bad year. The first family can now lend grain. But perhaps the loan comes with an expectation. Work in our fields. Give us some of your livestock. Marry into our family. Support us when we need labor. One favor becomes an obligation becomes a relationship. And eventually one household can become much more powerful than another. This didn't happen everywhere in exactly the same way. Some communities remain surprisingly resistant to permanent hierarchy. But agriculture created possibilities that mobile societies had rarely faced on the same scale. Surplus could be concentrated. And once surplus could be concentrated, some people could stop producing food themselves. They could become craftsmen, traders, administrators, religious specialists, warriors, or leaders. That sounds like progress, and in many ways it was, but it also created a new problem. The larger a settlement became, the harder it was to coordinate everyone. A small community could gather and discuss a problem, but imagine thousands of people living together. Who maintains the irrigation system? Who organizes a massive harvest? Who settles disputes? Who protects the food stores? Who decides where a wall should be built? Who organizes hundreds of workers? Who keeps track of what everyone owes? At some point, somebody has to coordinate all of this, and coordination creates authority. At first, that authority doesn't necessarily belong to a king. It might belong to a council, a group of elders, a powerful family, a religious institution, a temporary war leader. But here's where things become interesting. Different forms of power can reinforce each other. A family controls food. Food attracts followers. Followers provide protection. Protection creates military power. Military victories produce wealth and prestige. Prestige creates alliances. Alliances create marriages. Marriages create heirs. And suddenly, power isn't just something one person possesses. It's something an entire family can inherit. That is a huge transformation. Because now leadership doesn't have to begin again every generation. The son doesn't have to prove himself from scratch. He inherits his father's relationships, his wealth, his property, his title, his followers, his enemies, and eventually his father's claim to rule. But there was another force pushing societies towards stronger leadership. War. Permanent settlements were valuable. Grain could be stolen, animals could be captured, land could be conquered, trade routes could be attacked. And when your community is threatened, strong coordination suddenly becomes extremely attractive. A successful military leader could gather followers, organize defense, defeat rivals, and redistribute captured wealth. The problem was that temporary military authority could become permanent. A commander who was originally needed only during a crisis might discover that nobody was particularly interested in giving up his power afterward. Win enough battles, control enough resources, attract enough followers, and temporary authority starts looking like a permanent position. And this is where some of the earliest cities become incredibly important. By around 3200 BCE, southern Mesopotamia contained settlements that were dramatically different from the small villages of earlier periods. Uruk was one of them. It had monumental buildings, specialized workers, long-distance trade, religious institutions, administrators, thousands of people, and something else that would transform civilization forever. Writing. But the earliest writing wasn't primarily poetry. It wasn't stories about heroic kings. It was paperwork, grain, animals, labor, rations, officials. In other words, bureaucracy. Humans had created administration before they had perfected literature. And that tells us something important. The rise of kings wasn't just about one charismatic individual. It was about systems. Once society became large enough, authority could be recorded, resources could be counted, labor could be organized, obligations could be tracked, institutions could continue functioning even when individual people died. And that is exactly what makes a state different from a small community. The system starts becoming bigger than the individuals inside it. By the early dynastic period of Mesopotamia, cities such as Ur, Kish, Lagash, and Uruk were powerful political centers. Rulers appear in inscriptions, warfare appears repeatedly, elite burials display enormous differences in wealth. And then we get one of the most extraordinary archaeological discoveries from the ancient world, the royal cemetery at Ur. The graves contained astonishing quantities of luxury goods, gold, silver, lapis lazuli, weapons, musical instruments, vessels, objects that had traveled enormous distances, and some burials contained multiple human attendants. Whatever exactly happened during these funerals, the message of the cemetery is unmistakable. Some people had become extraordinarily important. Their status was not merely personal, it was being displayed through wealth, ceremony, architecture, and death itself. Even art began broadcasting hierarchy. One famous object from Ur shows soldiers, workers, animals, captives, and an important ruler-like figure. And the important figure is larger than everyone else. This wasn't a mistake. In ancient art, size could communicate status. The more important you were, the more visual space you could occupy. Power was becoming visible, but there was still one major problem. Why should everyone accept it? A ruler can have soldiers, but soldiers cannot stand next to every person every hour of every day. A king can't personally force thousands of people to obey. He needs something stronger. He needs legitimacy. And this is where religion becomes incredibly important. If a ruler can claim that the gods favor him, his authority becomes more than political. It becomes cosmic. He isn't simply saying, I won. He's saying the universe itself has placed me here. That is a much stronger argument. Mesopotamian rulers increasingly presented themselves as chosen or favored by the gods. They sponsored temples. They performed rituals. They celebrated victories as signs of divine approval. They presented themselves as responsible for justice, prosperity, warfare, and maintaining order between humans and the supernatural world. The famous Sumerian king list even presents kingship as having descended from heaven. It's difficult to imagine better political branding. Instead of saying, "My family took power during a complicated political struggle," you can say, "Heaven gave us the job." And suddenly rebellion isn't just rebellion against a ruler. It can become rebellion against the order of the universe. Religion also gave kingship something extremely useful: a schedule, festivals, ceremonies, processions, offerings, coronations, temple rituals. People repeatedly encountered the ruler in a sacred context. The king wasn't merely the man with the army. He appeared at the center of society's relationship with the gods. And then came monuments. Monuments are powerful because they make authority physical. A palace doesn't simply house a ruler. It demonstrates that somebody has enough resources to build a palace. A giant temple demonstrates organizational power. A city wall demonstrates military power. A royal statue demonstrates permanence. A tomb demonstrates wealth. And an inscription can literally write a ruler's version of history into stone. You can walk through power. You can look up at it. You can build your entire city around it. But even the most powerful ruler eventually dies. That creates a dangerous weakness in personal rule. If the king's authority depends entirely on the individual, what happens when he disappears? The solution is inheritance. The son inherits the throne. And now the ruler's death doesn't destroy the system. It transfers it. The new king inherits property. He inherits political relationships. He inherits military connections. He inherits religious rituals. He inherits titles. Most importantly, he inherits the story that his family belongs at the top. And over generations, that story becomes tradition. Eventually, people aren't simply obeying a powerful individual. They're obeying an institution. That distinction is enormous. Because an individual can die, an institution can survive. One of the clearest examples of this development is the Akkadian ruler Naram-Sin. During his reign in the 23rd century BCE, Naram-Sin went beyond simply presenting himself as a successful ruler. He took on divine status. In artistic representations, he appears elevated above ordinary humans. On his famous victory monument, he stands higher than his defeated enemies, climbing toward the heavens. His physical position communicates his political position. He is above everyone, and the message is obvious. Kingship was no longer just about controlling resources or commanding soldiers. It had become an entire worldview. The king stood between society, the gods, the army, the economy, and the political system. And once all of these things were connected, they began supporting one another. Taxes funded administrators. Administrators maintained records. Records supported institutions. Institutions supported armies. Armies protected rulers. Rulers funded temples. Temples legitimized rulers. And the whole system reinforced itself. The crown had become bigger than the person wearing it. This is perhaps the most important part of the story. The real invention wasn't the crown. It wasn't the throne. It wasn't even the king. The real invention was transferable authority. Humans discovered that power could belong to an office rather than just an individual. A ruler could die, but the position remained. A dynasty could continue. A bureaucracy could continue. A tax system could continue. A legal tradition could continue. And eventually, an entirely new generation could grow up believing that this arrangement was simply the natural order of things. That's when kingship becomes truly powerful. Because the most successful political systems don't have to force everyone every second. They teach people what is normal. A child grows up seeing the palace, hearing stories about the royal family, watching religious ceremonies, seeing soldiers obey the ruler, paying taxes to the administration, and eventually the question changes. Instead of asking, "Why does this person have power?" people begin asking, "Who will replace him?" That is the moment when personal dominance becomes institutional authority. And perhaps that is why the history of kings is both ridiculous and incredibly serious. The jewelry can seem absurd. The crowns, the enormous thrones, The elaborate titles, the claims of divine ancestry, the monuments designed to make one human being look larger than life. But underneath all of that was a very real human problem. How do thousands of strangers coordinate? How do they defend a city? How do they organize food? How do they settle disputes? How do they maintain roads, temples, walls, irrigation systems, armies, and trade? Human societies needed answers, and they experimented with many different ones. Some relied on councils. Some relied on powerful families. Some built complex institutions without obvious kings. Some developed hereditary rulers. There was never one universal path. But in certain places, economic power, military power, religious authority, administration, and inheritance became connected tightly enough that monarchy emerged. And once it did, it could become extraordinarily durable. Kings could conquer, they could build, they could protect, they could exploit, they could organize, they could redistribute wealth. They could also concentrate enormous amounts of wealth and labor into the hands of a tiny elite. The same institution that could build a city wall could force thousands of people to construct it. That contradiction is not an accident. It is part of the story. Kingship could solve genuine coordination problems while simultaneously creating enormous inequality. And perhaps that's why monarchy survived for so long. It wasn't simply a system based on force. It was a system that could provide real functions while surrounding itself with powerful stories. Protection, order, religion, tradition, family, identity, legitimacy. Once all of those became connected, challenging the king could mean challenging the entire system around him. And although modern societies are obviously very different from ancient kingdoms, one ancient idea still feels strangely familiar. The idea that authority can belong to an institution rather than a person. A president leaves office. A judge retires. A general dies. A company executive resigns. But the office remains. The person disappears. The institution continues. Ancient kings were one of humanity's earliest and most dramatic experiments with that idea. So did humans invent kings? Not really. They invented agriculture. They invented permanent settlements. They accumulated wealth. They created bureaucracy. They organized armies. They built religious institutions. They developed inheritance. They constructed monuments. They created stories about legitimacy. And eventually all those inventions collided. Out of that collision came the king. Not one ambitious man suddenly deciding he deserved a crown, but an entire society gradually creating a world in which a crown could make sense. And perhaps that brings us back to the strangest question of all. Why did that one person get the palace? Why did he get the army? Why did he get the taxes? Why did his family inherit the throne? Why did everyone else accept the arrangement? At first, perhaps the answer was simply power. Then it became wealth, then organization, then tradition, then religion, and eventually something even stronger took over. Belief. Because the greatest achievement of a king was not making people obey him at spear point. It was making people believe that the throne itself deserved to be obeyed. The man could die. The palace could survive. The army could survive. The bureaucracy could survive. The dynasty could survive. And the story could survive. That was the real invention, not the crown. The idea behind it. Humans learned how to make authority outlive the person who possessed it. And once that happened, political power would never be quite the same again. So the next time you see a crown sitting behind museum glass, don't just look at the gold. Look at the idea. Because you're not looking at the invention of one powerful man. You're looking at the invention of a story powerful enough to outlive him. And perhaps the strangest part is this. At some point, humans stopped asking why that particular man deserved the throne. They started believing in the throne itself.